surviving eyewitness of Custer's last stand told you the truth, and it wasn't what history books say? This is Charles Windolph's chilling account. History books tell us it was a heroic final fight, Custer and his men battling bravely until the bitter end. But the last surviving soldier of that battle, Charles Windolph, revealed a story so shocking, so haunting, that most schools never dared to teach it. This is not the polished version of history. This is the raw truth of mutilated bodies under the Montana sun, of men abandoned, of secrets buried for decades. And by the time you hear Windolph's account, you'll realize that the real horror of Little Bighorn wasn't just how Custer died, it was what came after. Stay with me until the end, because this is the side of history they never wanted you to know. But before we continue, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next eyewitness account. Charles Windolph was just 24 years old when he rode into history at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Decades later, at the remarkable age of 99, he passed away as the last surviving American veteran of that bloody field. For nearly 3/4 of a century, Windolph stayed silent. He carried the memories in his mind, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him. But in 1947, the silence finally broke. His memoir was published, an eyewitness account from the last living man to lay eyes on General George Armstrong Custer alive. And what Windolph revealed was as shocking as it was tragic. He had joined Custer's 7th Cavalry in 1873, assigned to Company H under Captain Frederick Benteen. Though he served under Custer, Windolph never considered him a friend. Officers in those days kept their distance from common soldiers. Custer, to him, was impressive, yes, but also distant, untouchable. Custer always struck me as aloof, Windolph later recalled. Benteen, on the other hand, was the finest soldier and the greatest gentleman I ever knew. The young trooper respected both men, but he made no secret of where his loyalty lay. I wouldn't call myself anti-Custer, he said, but I was for Benteen all the way. On the morning of June 25, 1876, everything changed. Scouts had spotted Sitting Bull's massive encampment. Before the regiment marched, Windolph walked to the officer's tent, hoping to speak to Benteen about exchanging his horse. But instead, he stumbled upon a tense moment, an argument between Benteen and Custer. "Shouldn't we keep the regiment together, General?" Benteen pressed. "If the reports are true, this is no small camp. We'll need every man we have." But Custer was unmoved. He dismissed the warning with a cold finality. "You have your orders." Windolph could not have known it at the time, but he had just overheard the fatal decision that would doom over 200 men. The officers dispersed. The men prepared for battle beneath the relentless June sun. Windolph never did get the chance to ask Benteen about that horse. The 7th Cavalry, more than 600 strong, moved out with confidence. The soldiers believed they faced perhaps 1,500 warriors at most, poorly armed, poorly organized. The odds, they thought, were in their favor. But Windolph would live long enough to know the cruel truth. They were marching straight into a storm unlike anything they had imagined. Custer's column was the first to move. Windolph watched him right away, just as he had seen the general ride countless times before. Only this time he had no way of knowing. It would be the very last. As the hours dragged on, Windolph began to wonder if they had been sent on a fool's errand. The men pushed their way through rugged hills, eyes sharp for any sign of the enemy. But nothing came. By mid-afternoon, they finally stumbled upon the charred remains of a camp once used by Sitting Bull's scouts, now reduced to ashes by Custer's own Indian allies. Then, out of the dust and heat, a lone rider appeared on the ridge. Windolph instantly recognized him, a sergeant from Tom Custer's company. He galloped straight toward them, shouting his message loud enough for all to hear. "Big village! Be quick! Bring the packs!" But these were orders that Captain Benteen would not follow. As the sergeant passed, he waved cheerfully, calling out that the enemy was already on the run. To the weary troopers, it sounded like the beginning of yet another routine victory, the kind the 7th Cavalry had grown accustomed to. Years later, Windolph would recall what the men were really thinking at that moment. "It'd be easy to say we were thinking of glory," he admitted. "But truth be told, most of the boys were thinking how good a cold bottle of beer would taste right then." But the mood shifted quickly. Around 4 o'clock, as Benteen's column reached a hill overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley, the sound of battle rolled up to them, distant at first, then unmistakable. The thunder of rifles, the cries of war. Benteen ordered his men to draw weapons and charge. Windolph spurred his horse, racing with his company toward the hilltop. And then, The valley opened up before them. Below lay a sprawling native encampment, far larger than anyone had imagined. Smoke curled above the lodges. Warriors poured across the hills in swarms, and scattered among them were American soldiers, fighting desperately, hopelessly outnumbered. To the north, Windolf spotted a knot of blue uniforms clinging to high ground. It was Major Reno's men, and they were barely holding on. The 7th Cavalry rushed to their aid. "I'll never forget the first sight of that hill," Windolf later wrote. "The men there were frightened, disorganized. They'd just watched dozens of their comrades cut down." By all rights, Reno's battered force should have been annihilated. Windolf believed only 2 things saved them: the mercy of God and the poor aim of the warriors surrounding them. That desperate defense would go down in history as the stand on Reno Hill. Benteen quickly took command, organizing the shattered troops and throwing up defensive lines. Yet even as they caught their breath, one chilling question echoed across the ranks. Where was Custer? From their position, they could see the native warriors shifting northward through the valley. Windolf assumed that Custer must have already begun his attack, but the truth was hidden by distance, the sounds of sporadic gunfire drifting faintly on the wind. As the soldiers waited with rifles at the ready, mules stumbled up the ridge, bringing food and ammunition. Reinforcements straggled in from the pack train, but still, no word from Custer. Another hour ticked by. Then, impatient and unwilling to wait, Captain Thomas Weir broke ranks. He spurred his horse forward, climbing to a rise that would later bear his name, Weir Point, desperate to discover what had become of the regiment's commander. Windolf and his comrades moved out after Captain Weir, but they barely made it to the next rise before the scouts raised the alarm. The warriors were coming, fast, and in overwhelming numbers. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey's C Company scrambled into position, throwing up a thin defensive line to hold back the onslaught. Their desperate stand was the only thing buying the rest of the command time to fall back toward Reno Hill. It was only a taste of what was to come. When Windolf reached Reno Hill, his heart sank. The place was no fortress. There was little natural cover for man or horse, and from the east a higher ridge loomed, perfect ground for native sharpshooters to rain down fire. Windolf and the men of Company H were ordered to hold the southern face of the hill. With nothing else to work with, they piled up saddles, boxes of food, and loose dirt to form makeshift barricades. It wasn't much protection at all, Windolf later admitted, but it made you feel a little safer. The warriors quickly encircled the hilltop. Then began the endless torment, a ceaseless torrent of bullets and arrows screaming overhead. Luckily for the besieged cavalry, the attacks were scattered, uncoordinated. There was no great unified charge, no single overwhelming blow. Instead, the pressure was constant, grinding the men down, but never breaking them completely. Hour after hour the battle raged beneath the burning sun. By the time darkness fell, more than a dozen troopers lay dead, and 36 more had been carried off wounded. Windolf never counted how many warriors he shot that day. He admitted later that the faces of those he killed had already blurred together in his memory. Night brought no peace. There was no moon to guide them, only the glow of fires flickering in Sitting Bull's great encampment below. From the valley drifted the low thrum of drums and war songs, an eerie counterpoint to the cries of the dying echoing across the hilltop. Windolf confessed he had never felt so utterly alone. "We felt 1,000,000 miles from nowhere," he said. "Death was all around us." And yet, even in that suffocating darkness, their thoughts kept turning back to Custer. Surely he and his men could not all be gone. Surely Custer the Lucky had found some way through. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon, Windolf and the others clawed at the earth with bayonets, knives, even tin plates, digging shallow ditches, anything that might keep them alive for one more day. Beside him, his closest comrade, Private Julian Jones, worked shoulder to shoulder, both men silently praying they'd see another sunrise. The digging was nearly finished when tragedy struck. Private Julian Jones, Windolf's closest friend, stood to peel off his heavy overcoat. In that instant, a rifle cracked. Jones let out a scream and crumpled beside him, a bullet tearing straight through his heart. Before Windolf could even process the horror, more shots slammed into the earth around him. Fury surged through his veins. He spun, sighted down his rifle, and fired desperately into the brush. But the shooter was gone. Then silence. The company surgeon rushed over. Windolf insisted he was unhurt, but when the doctor slipped a hand inside his shirt, it came back red with blood. A ricochet had found him, yet the adrenaline had masked the pain. It was only a flesh wound. Windolf waved the surgeon away. "Save your bandages for men who need them more." But the ordeal wasn't finished. Moments later, another shot rang out. This time, the bullet struck Windolf's own weapon. His rifle exploded in his hands, the stock splintering in a shower of wood and steel. Miraculously, he escaped with nothing worse than bruises and scratches, and a fresh weapon was quickly placed in his grip. He would need it. By midday on June 26th, a new terror gripped Reno Hill. The men were out of water. The wounded cried pitifully for relief, their lips cracked and swollen. Dehydration threatened to finish what bullets had not. A water detail was organized, and Windolf volunteered to cover them. What followed was a desperate dash. As Windolf and others laid down covering fire, the water party scrambled down the slope toward the river. Hidden marksmen opened up, cutting men down in the shallows. Windolf could do nothing but keep firing, helplessly watching as comrades were struck mid-step. Some made it back, some did not. But the survivors carried precious water, and in that moment they were hailed as heroes. Windolf, though, never forgot that there were many kinds of heroes that day. One was Captain Frederick Benteen. Unlike most officers, he walked openly among his men, exposing himself to fire, encouraging, steadying, even leading counterattacks when needed. "Get down, sir, you'll be killed," Windolf shouted at him once. "Don't worry about me," Benteen replied calmly. "I'm all right." That very afternoon, Benteen promoted Windolf on the spot to sergeant, recognizing his grit under fire. By evening, the gunfire slackened. The constant whistle of bullets faded into uneasy silence. Looking across the valley, the soldiers saw smoke drifting away from Sitting Bull's vast encampment. His people were beginning to move. The worst, it seemed, was finally behind them. And yet, an ominous shadow lingered. All through the night, one question haunted every man on that hilltop. Where was Custer? By now, fear was hardening into dreadful suspicion. Something terrible must have happened. But what? None of them could yet imagine. The grisly truth came with the dawn. General Alfred Terry's column finally reached Reno Hill, bringing reports too terrible to believe. The battlefield ahead was littered with the bodies of American soldiers. Terry, his face streaked with tears, gathered the men and gave the words they dreaded most. Custer, and every man with him, was dead. Windolf never forgot that moment. "I think most of us had tears in our eyes, too," he said quietly. Benteen handpicked 14 men to ride with him to the battlefield and confirm the reports. Windolf was among them. What they saw defied imagination. More than 200 naked, mutilated corpses lay scattered across the Montana hills, already bloating and blackening in the summer heat. The stench was suffocating. On a rise now called Last Stand Hill, they found Custer. His brother Tom lay beside him. Windolf stood nearby, holding Benteen's horse as the captain stepped forward to look down at the fallen commander. Custer's luck, so famous, so often spoken of, had finally run out. Aside from the bullet wounds in his chest and temple, it almost looked as if he were merely sleeping. Among the dead were men Windolf had drunk with, laughed with, fought beside for years. Friends, faces he knew as well as his own. Out of respect for them, he chose not to write down the grisly details. He said only that he helped bury them the next day. Windolf would remain in the 7th Cavalry for another 7 years. When he left the service, Captain Benteen described him in his discharge as a gallant soldier. He would even be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions at Reno Hill. And then, for decades, he stayed silent. Not until the 1930s, when Windolf was in his 80s, did he finally begin sharing his memories with historians. His recall was sharp, his details vivid. In 1947, his story was finally published in his memoir, I Fought with Custer. To the end, Windolf refused to play the blame game that haunted so many debates over Little Bighorn. He neither condemned Custer nor praised him blindly. To Windolf, both men, Custer and Benteen, were brave soldiers. But only one, Benteen, he called the finest soldier and greatest gentleman I ever knew. By then, Windolf was the last surviving white veteran of the Little Bighorn. His account became a priceless gift to history, an unbroken thread linking us to that summer day in 1876. Charles Windolf passed away peacefully in 1950 at 99 years old. With him went the final living memory of Custer's last stand, until he was at last reunited with the 268 men who had fallen on that hill so many years before.